It was the evening of October 18, 2019, when the call came through. I was in the kitchen of the station house, nursing a cup of burnt coffee and reviewing some search and rescue drills when the radio crackled to life. I still remember the voice of dispatch, clipped and firm. "Rescue 1, this is Central Dispatch. We've got a report of a missing person near the Green Hollow Woods, elderly male, 82, last seen heading out before the storm rolled in. Name's Harold Jensen." I glanced up at the old clock on the wall, 6:42 p.m. A late autumn storm was already pelting the station windows with sleet and rain. The wind had been picking up steadily all afternoon. I called for the rest of the team, Lena, Charlie, Reggie, and Eli, and within minutes, we were suiting up. Harold Jensen was well known around those parts. A third-generation farmer, he had lived alone for years on a stretch of land just south of the Hollister Creek. Tough as rawhide, Harold still maintained most of his acreage, though folks said age was catching up to him fast. His daughter, Rachel, had been the one to report him missing when he hadn't returned by sunset and didn't answer his phone. I had a bad feeling. You learn to listen to those instincts in this line of work. We loaded up the trucks and headed toward the Jensen property, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. The roads were already slick with mud and fallen leaves, and by the time we arrived, darkness was swallowing the countryside whole. Rachel met us on the porch, wrapped in a rain jacket, eyes wide and panicked. She told us Harold had gone out around noon to check on some fencing in the back pasture, something about a loose gate that might have let the cattle wander. He was supposed to be back before the weather turned. But he never returned. She also mentioned something else. He had Max with him, she said. His border collie. They go everywhere together. That name made my ears perk up. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a working dog through and through, one of those sharp-eyed, obedient border collies that never missed a cue. I had seen Max herd 30 head of cattle like clockwork at last year's county fair demo. Harold used to joke that Max was the better man on the farm. We huddled inside for a few minutes to look over a topographical map of the property and the woods beyond it. Then we set out, split into two groups, each with thermal scanners and radio contact. The rain made everything twice as hard, vision was limited, mud sucked at our boots, and the wind carried away sound. I led one team along the fence line toward the lower end of the pasture, while Lena took the ridge trail above the creek. Every 30 feet, we'd call out Harold's name. No answer. But just as we reached the far side of the pasture, something unexpected happened. I saw movement. A flash of black and white, low to the ground, darting along the tree line. "Hold up," I called. I raised my light and sure enough, there was Max. Wet, panting, eyes bright even in the downpour. He didn't bark or run. He just looked at us, then turned and trotted toward the trees. "Tom," Reggie said beside me, "is he trying to show us something?" "I think so," I replied, and started after him. That moment, that silent, deliberate glance from Max, was the first real lead we had. We followed him through the woods, ducking branches, boots slipping on mossy roots. Max would trot ahead a few paces, then stop and look back to make sure we were following. I radioed Lena's team and told them to shift southward, closer to the creek. We were onto something. The woods were dense here, and the wind made the trees groan above us. Several times I thought I heard something, a faint moan, or a snap of a branch, but it was hard to tell what was wind and what was man. Then Max stopped abruptly near a stand of pine and began circling a patch of ground. He whined, sniffed, and pawed at the underbrush. We moved in with flashlights. The ground here was uneven, sloping down toward a shallow ravine. "Harold," I shouted, and then, barely audible, "Here, over here." We froze. I dropped to my knees and started digging through the wet foliage. That's when we found him. Harold was crumpled at the base of the ravine, partly covered in pine needles and half soaked with rain. His right leg was twisted unnaturally, and there was a gash on his forehead. He was barely conscious. Max whined again and nudged his shoulder gently with his nose. We radioed for the medical team immediately. It took another 30 minutes to extract him safely using a stretcher and ropes. During that entire time, Max stayed by Harold's side, growling low if anyone got too close, but letting us work once he saw we meant no harm. By the time we reached the trucks, Harold was drifting in and out of awareness, but he managed a few words. Max brought you, didn't he? I nodded. He did. You trained him well. That was the beginning of it. The story that later spread through the county like wildfire, picked up by local radio and eventually made its way into regional papers. But none of that captured the urgency of that storm, the darkness of those woods, or the quiet resolve in Max's eyes as he led us through. What came next, in the days that followed, was even more remarkable. His injuries were serious but not fatal: compound fracture to his tibia, 3 broken ribs, and a mild concussion from hitting his head on a rock when he fell into that ravine. The doctors told us that if we had found him even a few hours later, hypothermia and shock might have finished the job the fall had started. It was that close. In the hours after the rescue, we all went back to the station, sore, soaked, but wired with adrenaline. Nobody really spoke much until the next morning. It was only then, over stale coffee and after action reports, that we realized the truth of what had happened. Max had stayed with Harold for nearly 6 hours in the freezing rain. He hadn't left to find help until nightfall, only after Harold passed out from pain. And when he did go, he found the right people. Us. It wasn't just that he ran into us by chance. He'd waited, watched us from the tree line, and chose to reveal himself. You don't forget that kind of intelligence in a dog. You just don't. A few days later, Rachel called the station and asked if we'd be willing to stop by the farm. There were some things she wanted to talk about. I figured she wanted to thank us. That kind of thing happened now and then, but the tone in her voice told me there was more to it. So that Sunday morning, I drove out alone. It was early. Mist still hovered over the fields, and crows circled low over the far tree line. The barn loomed in its usual quiet way, paint long faded to gray. Rachel met me at the front porch, her face tired but grateful. "Dad's stable now," she told me. "He'll be transferred to rehab next week. Says he's more mad about missing the fall cattle auction than about the broken leg." We laughed quietly at that. Then she motioned toward the back pasture. "Can I show you something?" We walked through the wet grass toward the old barn. Max wasn't with her, which surprised me. "He's inside," she said, answering the unasked question. "Hasn't left the barn since we brought him back." I followed her inside. The barn smelled of hay, oil, and animals. Sunlight poured through broken slats in dusty beams. And there, lying beside an empty feed trough, was Max. He was thinner than I remembered. Not malnourished, but lean, like a dog that had burned through reserves in a survival situation. His head lifted slightly as we approached. He didn't bark or wag. Just watched. "He hasn't gone back in the house," Rachel said. "He sleeps in here. Won't even eat unless I bring his food to the barn." "Is he sick?" She shook her head. "Vet said he's fine, physically, but something's changed. He's quiet, alert, like he's still on duty." I stepped closer, knelt down. Max didn't shy away, just looked me in the eye. "Hey, boy," I said softly. "You did good." His ears twitched, but he didn't move. Rachel crouched beside me. "You know, after they airlifted Dad out, when I came home from the hospital that first night, I checked the barn security camera. I wanted to make sure the animals had been fed before everything happened." She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "There's something you need to see." The footage was grainy, black and white. Dated the evening of October 18th, the day of the storm. It showed Max entering the barn around 3:30 p.m. He walked in, soaked, dragging branches and mud on his coat. Then he sat, and didn't move, for hours. From 3:30 until nearly 6:40 p.m., the time we found him, he stared at the barn door, head tilted toward the woods. Watching, waiting, and then, like a switch, he stood, turned, and bolted through the door. Straight toward where our team had been searching. Rachel's hands trembled a little as she held the phone. "He waited for you. He didn't just run for help. He knew." I didn't have anything to say to that. What do you say when an animal displays more calm resolve than half the men I've worked with in high-stress rescues? What I didn't know was this: Max had entered some sort of protective state. Border Collies are bred for precision, awareness, and endurance. But this wasn't herding instinct. This was devotion, at a level I'd only ever seen once before in a K9 unit that lost its handler in the line of duty. Max wasn't just a good dog. He was still trying to take care of Harold. Even though Harold was gone from the property, even though the storm was over, Max had assigned himself to duty and wouldn't stand down. I sat with him for almost an hour that morning, hand resting gently on his coat. Rachel brought out food, which he ignored until I moved the bowl closer. "You think he'll come around?" she asked. "I think he needs time," I said. "He hasn't let go yet." She nodded slowly. We talked a bit more about Harold's care plan, and then I headed out. But I couldn't get Max off my mind. Over the next 2 weeks, I checked in nearly every day. And every day, Max stayed near that barn or out along the fence line, patrolling quietly, watching the ridge where Harold had fallen. It wasn't until the day Harold came home from the hospital, November 4th, that something changed. Rachel called me around noon, voice full of wonder. "He came inside," she said. Max had heard the car. He hadn't seen Harold in over 2 weeks. But the moment he did, he ran from the barn like a shadow across the yard and threw himself at the old man's legs, gently, as if he knew to be careful with the injuries. Harold later told me he didn't remember much from the ravine. Just flashes, pain, cold, and one steady presence beside him. "I knew I wasn't alone," he said. "Even when I couldn't move or speak. I felt him breathing beside me. Every now and then I'd feel his nose nudge my shoulder. I think he kept me alive, Tom. I really do." I believed him. What happened with Max wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was loyalty, memory, and trust woven so tightly into instinct that it became something more. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 weeks later, another call came in. Another lost person in those woods. And Max would lead us again. You'd think a story like Harold's would be one of a kind. And you'd be right, in most cases. But rural life has its rhythms, and the land doesn't much care about luck or coincidence. In Green Hollow, people go missing. Sometimes they get found. Sometimes they don't. This time, we were lucky, because Max was still with us. It was November 18th, just 2 weeks after Harold returned home. Another early storm had rolled in. Not as severe as the one before, but cold, wet, and quick to turn ground into bog. Around 3:15 in the afternoon, dispatch called again. A 74-year-old woman, Doris Keenan, hadn't returned from mushroom foraging in the west end of Green Hollow. She'd left around 10 a.m. with her walking stick, no phone, and just a light jacket. That wasn't uncommon. Folks around here grew up in these woods. But the temperature had dropped below freezing by early afternoon, and there was a real risk of exposure. We geared up fast. As lead on call again, I grabbed my bag, my cold gear, and before heading out, made a call to Rachel Jensen. I'll admit, it felt odd. "Tom?" she asked when she picked up. "Is everything okay?" "Nothing's wrong here," I said, "but I need a favor." "Is Max around?" There was a pause. "He's lying on the porch," she said, looking toward the woods again. I didn't say anything. Rachel understood anyway. "Come get him." Max jumped into the back of my truck like he'd been waiting all morning. No barking, no hesitation, just alert eyes and a calm, steady posture as I pulled away from the Jensen farm and headed toward the incident command post outside the Green Hollow trailhead. When we arrived, a few of the younger deputies gave me that look, the kind they give when they think the old guy's lost it. A dog? From a farm? But Lena, Reggie, and Charlie didn't question it. They'd seen Max in action. We brought him to the last known location, Doris's truck, parked crooked near the edge of the access trail. A worn hiking stick rested on the passenger seat. No sign of recent footprints beyond the first few feet of trail. The storm had washed most of them away. Max sniffed the ground, then paused. I knelt beside him, holding out one of Doris's gloves. Rachel had picked it up from her house and handed it to me before I left. Max sniffed it, deeply. Then he looked up. And then he was gone, bounding into the woods, tail high, head low. I followed. The land was steeper here, dense with underbrush and wet rock. Max moved quickly, but not erratically. Every few minutes, he stopped, waited just long enough to make sure we were behind, then continued. It wasn't chaotic like you see with some untrained dogs. It was measured, focused. He wasn't just looking. He was tracking. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. We reached a dry ravine where the earth had split slightly, shallow, but deep enough to twist an ankle or worse. Max suddenly stopped and began pacing along the edge, nose close to the leaves. Then he gave one sharp bark. The first we'd heard since we started. I slid down into the ravine, flashlight sweeping. And there, tucked between two logs, covered in pine needles and barely conscious, was Doris Keenan. Her skin was pale and waxy. Her left foot was twisted beneath her. She was whispering to herself, lips blue with cold. When she saw us, her eyes widened slightly. "Thought I heard something," she mumbled. "Didn't think anyone had come." I radioed for medics immediately. We got a thermal blanket on her, stabilized her leg, and gave her sips of warm water. As we worked, Max lay down beside her. Not touching, but close enough to shield from wind. She noticed. "Who's this fine boy?" she whispered. "This is Max," I said. "He's the one who found you." Doris made it. Mild frostbite in 2 toes, fractured ankle, early hypothermia, but nothing she couldn't recover from. What struck me most, though, came a few days later, when I visited her in the hospital. She was sitting up, cheerful, with her big white hair puffed like a dandelion under the fluorescent lights. "You know," she said, "I heard him before I saw you. That dog. Like breathing near me. It's what kept me awake. Thought it was a bear at first," she laughed. "But no bear smells like fresh hay and wood smoke." I nodded. "He stayed with you until we got there." "Course he did," she said, voice suddenly serious. "He's still working." Max returned to the Jensen farm after that, but something had changed. People started coming out just to see him. Local school kids wrote letters. The sheriff's department quietly entered his name for a regional commendation, not something that happens often for non-service animals. But what made it real for all of us wasn't awards or news stories. It was what Harold said, one cold December morning, as he leaned on his cane and watched Max trotting along the fence line. "I used to think dogs worked for food and shelter," he said. "But now I know. Some of them work because they were born for it." He looked at Max. He was never just a farm dog. Max never retired, not in the way most people think of it. But after that second rescue, he slowed down. Not physically, he was still quick on his feet, but in his heart. Like he'd completed something, fulfilled a promise. He still followed Harold from barn to porch. Still barked at deer that wandered too close. But he slept more, listened more, and he was always watching the ridge. Just in case. By the following spring, I heard that Harold had built a small wooden plaque near the ravine where Max found him. It wasn't fancy. Just a board, sanded smooth, mounted to a tree. Burned into the wood were 5 words. "Max led me back home." And that's the story, exactly as it happened. No heroics. No embellishment. Just a dog, a storm, and a quiet kind of bravery that changed more than one life out there in Green Hollow. We still talk about Max in our rescue briefings. Still tell the rookies to pay attention when a dog looks you in the eye like that. Because sometimes, the best rescuer on your team doesn't carry a radio. He just listens and leads.